It was August 2015, and a construction crew was hard at work in the dense forest of Woodland Park, Colorado. Specifically, they were working on a property known as the Thunderhead Ranch, causing a massive amount of noise and kicking up clouds of dust into the hot summer air. The owner of the property, a man named Chuck Murphy, had decided it was finally time to tear down an old, abandoned cabin that had been sitting on his land, rotting away for decades. Chuck had big plans for this land. He wanted to build a series of nice new homes, maybe develop the area a bit. But first, this eyesore of a cabin had to go. So Chuck was there watching the operation, supervising as the heavy machinery tore into the wood. The cabin was in terrible shape. It was damp, it smelled of mildew, and it was basically falling apart on its own. So the demolition crew thought this was going to be an easy job, maybe a few hours of work tops. They brought in an excavator, and the operator began smashing the bucket into the roof and the walls, splintering the old timber like it was matchsticks. But then the operator hit a snag. As the walls came down, there was one part of the structure that just wouldn't budge: the chimney. Unlike the rest of the cabin, which was made of rotting wood, the chimney was a solid beast made of heavy stones and brick. The excavator operator tried to knock it over, but it was stubborn. So Chuck Murphy signaled for them to stop. He didn't want to damage the machinery or cause an accident. So they decided they would have to dismantle the chimney the hard way, by hand, taking it apart stone by stone. The crew got out of the heavy machines and grabbed sledgehammers and pry bars, and they walked over to the chimney, which was now standing alone amidst the rubble like a tombstone. They started prying off the stones near the top, working their way down. About halfway down, one of the workers pried a large rock loose, and it fell to the ground with a thud, opening up a dark hole into the interior of the chimney shaft. Curiosity got the better of the worker, and he leaned in to look through the hole, just to see how far down it went or if maybe there were any animals nesting inside. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw something that made his blood run cold. At first, he thought it was maybe a rotting log or a bundle of clothes that a squatter had stuffed in there. But then he saw the boots, and he realized with a jolt of horror that he wasn't looking at trash. He was looking at a human body, jam-packed inside the narrow shaft. This story sounds like an urban legend, something you'd hear around a campfire to scare kids, but it is 100% true. It starts as a standard missing person case, the kind you hear about on the news all the time, but it ends as a claustrophobic nightmare that is almost impossible to comprehend. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload every single week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to a pool party, but right when they jump into the deep end, remove the ladder. While they are swimming, also please subscribe to the Mr. Cipher podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. To understand the absolute horror of what was found in that cabin, we first have to go back 7 years to May of 2008 in the town of Woodland Park, Colorado. Woodland Park is this beautiful, quiet mountain town, often called the city above the clouds because of its high elevation. It's the kind of place people move to when they want to get away from the noise of the city and just be close to nature. It's full of pine trees, hiking trails, and fresh air. Living in this town was the Maddux family. The Maddux family was well known and well liked in the community. The father, Mike Maddux, was a musician and a creative soul, and his kids had inherited that same artistic spirit. But the one who seemed to embody it the most was his 18-year-old son, Joshua Maddux. Joshua, or Josh as everyone called him, was a distinct character. If you saw him walking down the street, you would notice him immediately. He was tall and lanky, with a mess of long, shaggy blonde hair that he constantly had to brush out of his eyes. He had this gentle, sort of goofy smile that made him instantly likable to pretty much everyone he met. Josh was a free spirit in the truest sense of the word. He wasn't really concerned with fitting in or being popular or chasing after money. He just wanted to play his music, write, and spend time in the woods. He was a talented musician who played the guitar, and he spent hours in his room or sitting on the back porch just strumming away, writing songs that were far deeper and more complex than you'd expect from a teenager. He was also incredibly intelligent. Peers and teachers described him as brilliant, but he marched to the beat of his own drum. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't getting into fights or doing hard drugs. He was just floating, happily existing in his own world. But despite his happy-go-lucky exterior, Josh was dealing with a heavy burden. Just 2 years prior, in 2006, the Maddux family had been struck by a terrible tragedy. Josh's older brother Zachary had committed suicide. It was a devastating blow that shattered the family's sense of security. Losing a child is something a parent never gets over, and losing a sibling, especially one you grew up with, can fundamentally change a person. For Josh, losing Zachary was deeply painful. It left a void in his life that music and nature helped to fill. But it also made his family, especially his dad Mike and his 2 sisters, incredibly protective of one another. They had already lost one member of their pack, and they were terrified of losing another. So even though Josh was 18 and technically an adult, his family always kept a close eye on him, checking in, making sure he was doing okay mentally and emotionally. And by all accounts, in May of 2008, Josh seemed to be doing okay. He was making plans for the future, he was writing new music, he was hanging out with friends. He seemed to have processed the grief and was moving forward with his life, which makes what happened next so incredibly confusing and tragic. It was May 8, 2008, a Thursday. The weather was crisp and clear. Typical spring weather in the mountains. Josh was at home hanging out with his sister Kate. The house was calm. There was no fighting, no drama. Josh didn't seem agitated or depressed. He was just his normal, chill self. At one point in the morning, Josh stood up, stretched, and told Kate he was going to go for a walk. This was not unusual at all. Like I mentioned, Josh loved nature. He walked everywhere. Woodland Park is surrounded by dense forest, and Josh would often just wander off into the woods to think or to find inspiration for his songs. Sometimes he'd be gone for an hour, sometimes a few hours, but he always came back. So when Josh put on his gray hooded sweatshirt and grabbed his guitar, well, actually, he didn't grab his guitar this time, which was maybe the only slight deviation from his routine. Usually, he took it everywhere, but this time he just put his hands in his pockets, smiled at his sister, and walked out the front door. Kate watched him go, watching his tall, lanky frame disappear down the driveway and onto the street. She didn't feel any sense of dread. She didn't have a premonition that something was wrong. She just thought her brother was going to get some fresh air. She went back to whatever she was doing, expecting to hear the front door open and hear Josh's voice in a couple of hours. But a couple of hours passed and Josh didn't come back. The sun started to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the pine trees, and still no sign of Josh. By dinner time, his dad Mike was home and he asked where Josh was. Kate said he went for a walk earlier. Mike felt a little flicker of worry, but he pushed it down. Josh was 18, he was a free spirit. Maybe he ran into a friend. Maybe he lost track of time sitting by a creek somewhere. Mike tried to eat dinner, but he kept glancing at the clock on the wall. 7 p.m. came and went. 8 p.m. The sun was down now, it was getting dark outside, and in the mountains, when it gets dark, it gets pitch black and the temperature drops rapidly. Mike's worries started to turn into anxiety. He called Josh's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. He called again, same thing, straight to voicemail. Now the family was getting scared. They had already been through the trauma of losing Zachary, so their panic threshold was much lower than a typical family's might be. Mike started calling Josh's friends, asking, "Hey, have you seen Josh? He went for a walk and hasn't come back." Every single friend said the same thing. "No, haven't seen him, haven't heard from him." By late that night, Mike Maddux couldn't sit still anymore. He got in his car and started driving around the neighborhood, rolling down his windows, calling out Josh's name into the dark, quiet streets. He drove to the spots he knew Josh liked to hang out. The local parks, the trailheads, the convenience store where he'd grab snacks, but everywhere he went, it was empty. The town was asleep, and Josh was nowhere to be found. Mike drove back home, hoping to see Josh sitting on the front porch, maybe laughing about how he lost track of time, but the porch was empty, the house was quiet, the feeling of dread in the pit of Mike's stomach was growing heavier by the second. He knew something was wrong. This wasn't like Josh. Sure, he was independent, but he wasn't inconsiderate. He knew his family worried. He wouldn't just vanish for an entire day and night without calling. The next morning, May 9th, Mike Maddux went to the Woodland Park Police Department and officially reported his son missing. The police took the report, but initially they weren't exactly launching a massive manhunt. You have to remember, Josh was 18 years old. Technically, in the eyes of the law, he was an adult who had the right to walk away from his life if he wanted to. And unfortunately, because of his brother's suicide 2 years earlier, there was a theory floating around that maybe Josh was depressed, maybe he had run away to start over, or worse, maybe he had gone into the woods to hurt himself. Mike Maddux refused to believe that. He told the police over and over again, "Look, I know my son. He was happy. He was making plans. He wouldn't just leave us, especially after what we went through with Zachary. He wouldn't put us through that pain again." But without any evidence of foul play, no ransom note, no signs of a struggle at the house, no witnesses seeing him get abducted, the police were limited in what they could do. They put out a missing person alert, they circulated Josh's picture, but they couldn't exactly drag to Lake or call in the FBI for an 18-year-old who just walked out his front door. Days turned into weeks. The Maddux family was living in a state of suspended animation. Every time the phone rang, they jumped, hoping it was Josh. Every time a car pulled into the driveway, they ran to the window, but it was never him. Mike Maddux refused to give up. He printed out thousands of flyers with Josh's face on them, that shaggy blonde hair, that gentle smile, and he plastered them all over Woodland Park. He drove to neighboring towns like Colorado Springs and Denver and put up flyers there too. He contacted local news stations begging them to run a story on his son. Strangers would see the flyers and call in tips saying, "I think I saw him at a gas station in Albuquerque," or "I saw a guy who looked like him hitchhiking on I-70. Mike would chase down every single lead. He would drive for hours to check out a sighting, only to find it was just some other tall, skinny kid with long hair. Every time he hit a dead end, a little piece of hope would break off, but he kept going, because that's what fathers do. Months passed, then years. May 2008 turned into May 2009, then 2010. The missing person posters started to fade and peel in the sun. Eventually, people stopped talking about Josh Maddux. The town moved on. New tragedies happened. News stories took over the headlines. But inside the Maddux home, time had stopped. Josh's room was left exactly as it was the day he walked out. His bed was unmade. His guitar sat in the corner gathering dust. His clothes were still in the closet. It was a shrine to a boy who had simply ceased to exist. Mike Maddux lived in a personal hell. The not knowing is often described as worse than knowing, even if the news is bad. Because without answers, your mind creates endless scenarios. Is he being held captive somewhere? Did he fall into a ravine and hit his head? Does he have amnesia? Is he living a new life in California and simply doesn't want to talk to us? Mike tortured himself with these questions every single day for 7 long years. 7 years is a long time. In 7 years, a person can change completely. Cells regenerate, memories fade, landscapes change. And in Woodland Park, the landscape was literally changing. Just 2 blocks away from the Maddux family home, literally less than a quarter of a mile, a 5-minute walk, sat the Thunderhead Ranch, owned by Chuck Murphy. Chuck was a well-known figure in the area, a developer who had owned this large plot of land since the 1950s. The property had a long history. Back in the day, it had been a homestead, specifically a place for illegal gambling and drinking way back in the 1930s. The main cabin on the property was built fast and cheap, a large wooden structure that had served as a speakeasy and a dining hall back when the ranch was known as a rowdy place to have a good time. But by 2015, that cabin was a wreck. It had been abandoned for decades. Nature had reclaimed it. Animals had moved in. The roof was sagging, the windows were broken or boarded up. It was basically a haunted house in the middle of the woods. Chuck Murphy visited the property occasionally, but mostly it just sat there, collecting pine needles and snow. But in August of 2015, Chuck decided enough was enough. The land was valuable, and he wanted to clear it for development. He hired that demolition crew, and on August 6, 2015, they rolled in with their excavators and bulldozers, ready to wipe the Thunderhead Ranch cabin off the map. This brings us back to that horrifying moment I described at the beginning. The excavator smashing into the wood, the dust flying, and then that stubborn stone chimney refusing to fall. The workers stopped the machines, the dust settled, and silence fell over the forest, except for the birds chirping and the heavy breathing of the men as they picked up their sledgehammers. They approached the chimney, annoyed that this was going to take extra physical labor. They didn't know that they were standing inches away from solving one of the town's biggest mysteries. As they peeled away the stones and the worker peered into that dark hole and saw the boots, the atmosphere instantly shifted from annoyance to pure adrenaline. Confusion set in immediately. Why would there be boots inside a chimney? Was it a prank? Had someone stuffed a mannequin in there? The worker called out to his foreman, "Hey, you gotta come see this." The foreman walked over, looked into the gap in the stones and saw the same thing. Boots, and above the boots, legs. Denim jeans. It was a person. There was a person inside the chimney. Realizing this was a crime scene, or at least a scene of death, they immediately stopped all work. Everyone backed away from the chimney as if it was radioactive. Chuck Murphy called 911, his voice shaking as he told the dispatcher, "Look, we're tearing down a cabin and we found a body inside the chimney." Within minutes, the Woodland Park police arrived, sirens wailing, cutting through the quiet forest. The same police department that had taken the missing person report for Josh Maddux 7 years earlier was now taping off a scene just 2 blocks from his house. Detectives arrived and assessed the situation. It was a logistical nightmare. The body was wedged tight deep inside the narrow chimney shaft. They couldn't just reach in and pull it out. They had to carefully dismantle the rest of the chimney stone by stone to extract the remains without damaging them. It was a slow, gruesome process. As they removed more stones, the position of the body became clearer. The person was in a fetal position, knees tucked up towards the chest, jammed into a space that was barely big enough for a child, let alone a full-grown adult. The body was mummified. Because of the dry Colorado air and the protection of the chimney, the decomposition had halted at a certain point, preserving the skin and the clothes. Strangely, the body was wearing a thermal shirt, but no other top clothing, just that shirt and jeans. When they finally freed the remains from the stone tomb, the coroner took over. They transported the body to the lab for identification, but honestly, the police already had a sinking feeling. They knew about the missing Maddux boy. Everyone in town knew. His house was right there, just through the trees. It seemed too coincidental to be anyone else. Using dental records, the coroner confirmed their worst fears. The body in the chimney was Joshua Maddux, the boy who had gone for a walk 7 years ago and never came back. Finally, Mike Maddux had his answer. Josh hadn't run away. He hadn't started a new life in California. He hadn't been kidnapped by strangers on the highway. He had been right there the whole time, practically in their backyard, decomposing inside a chimney while his father drove the streets screaming his name. But if you think the discovery of the body is the end of the mystery, you are dead wrong. Because as investigators started to piece together how Josh ended up in that chimney, the details didn't add up. In fact, they made no sense at all. The first theory was simple and tragic, an accident. The theory went like this. Josh was walking in the woods, he saw the abandoned cabin, he decided to explore. Being a young, adventurous guy, maybe he climbed up onto the roof. Maybe he was trying to look down the chimney, or maybe he saw something inside and tried to shimmy down, Santa Claus style, to get in, and he got stuck. It's a horrific way to die, but it's straightforward, right? Wrong. Chuck Murphy, the owner of the cabin, immediately shook his head when he heard the accident theory. He told police that there was absolutely no way Josh or anyone else could have accidentally fallen down that chimney, and he knew this for a fact because he had built the thing himself, or at least he had overseen its construction and maintenance. Murphy explained that when the cabin was originally built back in the 1950s, it was designed with a very specific feature to keep animals out. Raccoons, birds, and squirrels are a constant nuisance in Woodland Park, and a wide-open chimney is basically a welcome mat for pests. So to prevent critters from nesting inside the chimney, a heavy-duty steel mesh, specifically a grate made of thick rebar, had been installed into the brickwork itself, about 1 row of bricks down from the top. This wasn't just a piece of chicken wire resting on top that you could easily push aside or stomp through. This was heavy steel construction material embedded into the masonry, meant to be permanent. Murphy told investigators that checking that grate was part of his routine whenever he inspected the property. He said he had been up there on the roof just a few years prior to the discovery, and the grate was definitely there, and it was definitely secure. So for Josh to have entered the chimney from the roof, he would have had to bring heavy tools with him up onto the roof, like wire cutters or a saw capable of cutting through steel rebar. He would have had to cut the grate away, remove the debris, and then jump in. But no tools were found on the roof, and no tools were found with Josh's body, and the grate itself was missing entirely. Somehow it had been removed, but there was no explanation for how or when. But the problems with the accident theory didn't stop at the roof. The investigators went inside the cabin to look at the fireplace itself. Naturally, if you fall down a chimney, you should land in the fireplace hearth, right? You should tumble down, getting scraped and bruised, and land in a pile of soot at the bottom, and then you would just crawl out into the living room. But when police examined the fireplace inside the cabin, they found something that made the accident theory not just unlikely, but physically impossible. A large, heavy wooden breakfast bar, basically a massive piece of furniture that had been ripped out of the kitchen wall during a previous renovation, had been shoved directly in front of the fireplace opening. And it wasn't just sitting there, it was jammed up against the opening specifically to block the draft coming from the chimney. Chuck Murphy confirmed that he had moved that breakfast bar there years ago to seal off the fireplace because the cabin was drafty and he didn't want the cold air getting in. So think about this for a second. If Josh had somehow managed to remove the steel grate on the roof without tools and then decided to slide down the chimney for some unknown reason, he would have slid all the way down and hit the bottom, but he would have been trapped because the opening was blocked by a massive piece of furniture that he couldn't possibly move from the inside. He would have been stuck in the dark, screaming for help just inches away from the safety of the room, but unable to get out. But wait, it gets even worse, because when the coroner examined the body and the position it was in, they realized Josh didn't hit the bottom. Josh was found with his knees tucked up to his chest, in a fetal position, and his body was wedged in the chimney shaft slightly above the floor level. This suggests that he didn't just fall straight down. If he had fallen, he would have likely suffered broken ankles or broken legs from the impact, but the autopsy revealed no broken bones, no blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. This implies that Josh might have been lowered into the chimney, or he climbed in feet first and got stuck halfway down. But again, why would he do that? And how did he get past the steel grate? And then, there is the most disturbing detail of all, the clothing. When they recovered Josh's body, he was wearing a thermal shirt, but he was naked from the waist down except for his socks and his boots. His jeans were found inside the chimney with him, but he wasn't wearing them. His pants were actually found neatly folded, or at least bunched up, next to his legs inside the tight space. Imagine the logistics of that. If you are sliding down a chimney, a narrow, rough stone shaft that is scraping your skin, you physically cannot take your pants off inside that space. It is too tight. You can't bend over to untie your shoes. You can't wiggle your legs enough to slide denim off. So this means Josh likely entered the chimney without his pants on, or they were removed before he was put in there. So now the police are looking at this and they are realizing, okay, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a kid exploring and getting stuck. This was something else entirely. The missing steel grate, the furniture blocking the exit, the lack of pants, the positioning of the body, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Someone put him there. Someone murdered Joshua Maddux and stuffed his body down the chimney to hide it, knowing that nobody would ever look there. And they were right. Nobody looked there for 7 years. Once the determination was made that foul play was likely, the police had to pivot. This was no longer a recovery mission, it was a homicide investigation, albeit a very cold one. They had to go back to 2008 and look at Josh's life with a fine-tooth comb. Who was he hanging out with? Did he have enemies? Was there anyone in his circle who was capable of violence? Mike Maddux, Josh's dad, had been racking his brain for 7 years, and he had always felt that the police hadn't looked hard enough at the people Josh spent time with. Specifically, there was one name that kept coming up. A young man who had been friends with Josh in high school. a guy named Andrew Newman. Andrew Newman was a drifting, transient type of character, much different from Josh. While Josh was a gentle, creative soul, Andrew had a darker edge. He was known around town for being erratic, he had a history of getting into trouble, and his behavior was often described by peers as aggressive and unpredictable. Despite their differences, Josh and Andrew hung out occasionally. They were part of the same wider social circle of musicians and nature lovers in Woodland Park. But according to some of Josh's friends, in the weeks leading up to Josh's disappearance, the dynamic between Josh and Andrew had gotten weird. Investigators started digging into Andrew Newman's background, and what they found was absolutely chilling. It turned out that after Josh disappeared in May of 2008, Andrew Newman's life had spiraled into a violent, chaotic spree of crimes that stretched across the country. Looking at his rap sheet was like reading the diary of a serial killer in the making. Just a year after Josh vanished, in 2009, Andrew Newman had moved to New Mexico. There, he got into an altercation with a landlord. Apparently, Andrew was squatting in a property or refusing to pay rent, and when the landlord confronted him, Andrew attacked him. But he didn't just punch him, Andrew stabbed the landlord to death during the fight. Police arrested Andrew and charged him with murder, but in a twist of fate that seems incredibly unfair, Andrew claimed self-defense. He argued that the landlord had attacked him first, and he was just fighting for his life. The New Mexico court system reviewed the evidence, and apparently there wasn't enough to disprove his claim, so the charges were eventually dismissed, or at least he wasn't convicted of murder. He served some time for lesser charges, but he was eventually released back onto the streets. But that wasn't the end of Andrew's violence. Later, he found himself in another terrifying situation in Taos, New Mexico. He had broken into a woman's house while she was home. Imagine being that woman. You are sitting in your living room watching TV, and suddenly this strange man bursts in, his eyes wild, looking like he hasn't slept in days. He overpowered the woman and forced her into a barrel, literally tried to stuff her into a large container, claiming that he was going to take her somewhere. But luckily, the woman fought back. She managed to escape and call the police. Andrew was arrested again for burglary and assault, but once again, through a series of legal maneuverings and perhaps mental health evaluations, he managed to avoid a life sentence. He was bouncing in and out of institutions and jails, constantly slipping through the cracks of the justice system. When the Woodland Park police learned all of this, they realized they had a prime suspect. Here was a guy who was friends with Josh, who was in Woodland Park when Josh disappeared, and who had a documented history of stabbing people and trying to stuff them into small spaces, like a barrel or maybe a chimney. It seemed to fit the profile perfectly. But the most damning piece of evidence wasn't just his criminal record. It was a tip that came in from a member of the public. After the news broke about the body in the chimney, a person came forward. Let's call him a witness, who claimed that years ago, right around the time Josh went missing, Andrew Newman had actually bragged about killing him. According to this witness, Andrew had been drunk or high at a party and had started rambling about how he had put Josh in a hole and that nobody would ever find him. At the time, people just brushed it off as Andrew being crazy or trying to sound tough. Nobody actually believed he had murdered his friend. But now, with Josh's body found in a literal hole, a chimney, those words took on a horrifying new meaning. Police tried to track down Andrew Newman to interview him about Josh's death, but finding him was easier said than done. Andrew was a drifter, living off the grid, moving between states, often homeless, often using fake names. He was a ghost in the system. However, eventually they located him. But when they looked at the evidence they had, specifically regarding the chimney case, they hit a wall. Basically, everything they had was circumstantial. Yes, Andrew was violent. Yes, he was there at the time. Yes, he allegedly bragged about it. But there was no physical forensic evidence tying him to the cabin. There were no fingerprints on the chimney. Remember, it had been 7 years and the weather and time would have washed any prints away. There was no DNA found on Josh's body that belonged to Andrew. The body was mummified and degraded. Finding foreign DNA after that long in those conditions is nearly impossible. Plus, the timeline was fuzzy. Exactly what day did Josh die? The coroner couldn't pinpoint the exact date of death, only a range, so Andrew could claim he was somewhere else on that specific day, and without a precise time of death, the police couldn't prove he was lying. So, despite the overwhelming suspicion, the district attorney in Teller County, Colorado, decided not to press charges against Andrew Newman for the murder of Joshua Maddux. They said there simply wasn't enough hard evidence to secure a conviction in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt. Mike Maddux was devastated. He felt in his gut that Andrew was responsible. He felt that the system was failing his son all over again. First, they failed to find him for 7 years, and now that he was found, they were failing to bring his killer to justice. But let's go back to the scene for a moment and reconstruct what might have happened if the murder theory is true, because the logistics of it are truly the stuff of nightmares. Imagine it's May 2008. Josh and Andrew are hanging out. Maybe they are walking in the woods, drinking or smoking, having a good time. They come across the abandoned Thunderhead Ranch cabin. It's a cool, creepy spot, perfect for 2 teenagers to explore. They go inside, they look around, maybe they climb up onto the roof to look at the view. Something happens, an argument maybe. Josh says something that sets Andrew off, or maybe Andrew just snaps. Remember, this is a guy who later stabbed a landlord to death and stuffed a woman in a barrel. Maybe Andrew attacks Josh on the roof, or maybe he attacks him inside the cabin and drags him up to the roof. If Josh was knocked unconscious, or if he was threatened with a knife, he would be compliant. Andrew then uses some tools, maybe he found them on the property, or maybe he had them in his backpack, to pry up the steel grate covering the chimney. Then he forces Josh into the hole. But why was Josh naked from the waist down? This is the part that haunts investigators. One theory is that it was a humiliation tactic. Some killers strip their victims to make them feel vulnerable and powerless. Maybe Andrew forced Josh to undress at knife point before forcing him into the chimney. Or maybe the clothes were removed after Josh was dead and thrown in separately, confusing the crime scene. But the fact that the pants were found inside the chimney with him suggests they went in together. Now imagine the moment Josh goes into the shaft. If he was still alive, which the autopsy couldn't rule out, he would have been plunged into total darkness. The stone walls would be scratching his back and chest as he slid down, gravity taking over. He falls, and then thud. He hits the blockage, the breakfast bar jamming the fireplace opening. He is trapped. His knees are pushed up against his chest because the shaft is so narrow he can't straighten his legs. He can't move his arms effectively to climb back up because it's a smooth vertical shaft and he has no leverage. He screams. He screams for help, shouting Andrew's name, shouting for his dad, shouting for anyone. But the cabin is in the middle of the woods, 2 blocks away from his house. But the heavy stone of the chimney muffles the sound, and the cabin itself is insulated by the thick forest. Nobody hears him. He is alone in the dark, gradually realizing that this is where he is going to die. The psychology of that is unbearable to think about. Did he survive for hours, days, without food or water in the pitch-black silence? Eventually, hypothermia or dehydration would set in, or perhaps positional asphyxia, where the position of his body makes it impossible to breathe properly, and he simply suffocates slowly. As the sun rose and set over Woodland Park for 7 years, Josh remained in that vertical coffin while his family ate dinner just down the street, while his sister watched TV, while his dad drove past the cabin on his way to work. Josh was right there, silent and frozen in time. It is also worth noting that there were other rumors in the town about the cabin. Some local kids claimed that the cabin smelled bad years before the body was found. They said it had a dead animal smell whenever they played near it, but nobody investigated because, well, it's an abandoned cabin in the woods. Dead raccoons or squirrels are common, so the smell of a decomposing human body was dismissed as just part of the nature of the place. This adds another layer of tragedy to the story, that there were signs, subtle clues that were ignored because nobody was looking for a body in a chimney. Now, I want to pause here and address the skeptics, because even with all the evidence pointing to murder, there are still people online and even some law enforcement officials who cling to the accident theory. They argue that maybe the steel grate had been removed years prior by the owner and he just forgot, or maybe vandals removed it. They argue that maybe Josh was cold and tried to climb down the chimney to get into the cabin to warm up, and he got stuck, and in his panic, he kicked his pants off, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, which happens when people have severe hypothermia. They feel incredibly hot, so they strip off their clothes. But this theory has massive holes. Paradoxical undressing usually happens when you are already in the final stages of freezing to death, not when you are first entering a shelter. And even if he did take his pants off, how did he fold them or bunch them up next to him in a shaft where he couldn't move his legs? And why would he climb down a chimney head first or feet first into a dark hole without knowing if the bottom was clear? It goes against every survival instinct a human has, especially someone like Josh who is smart and outdoor savvy. The murder theory involving Andrew Newman, or perhaps another unknown assailant, is the only one that accounts for the strange details, especially the missing grate and the furniture blockage. But without a confession and without DNA, the case officially remains classified in a sort of limbo. The death certificate lists the cause of death as unknown and the manner of death as accidental, essentially defaulting to the idea that he got stuck. But everyone in Woodland Park, everyone who knew Josh, and everyone who knows the history of Andrew Newman believes otherwise. This case leaves us with a profound sense of unease, not just because of the gruesome nature of the death, but because of the proximity it forces us to look at our own neighborhoods, our own backyards, and wonder what secrets are hidden just out of sight. We assume that if someone goes missing, they are gone, far away, but sometimes the lost are incredibly close, just separated from us by a few layers of brick and stone and a few degrees of bad luck. After the discovery of Josh's body, the cabin was finally demolished completely, the chimney was taken down, and the site was cleared. The land was eventually developed just as Chuck Murphy intended, but the memory of what happened there hangs over the town like a dark cloud. The Maddux family finally got closure in the sense that they had a body to bury, they could hold a funeral, they could visit a grave instead of a missing person poster. But the lack of justice, the fact that nobody has ever been charged for Josh's death, keeps the wound open. But the story doesn't end with the demolition of the cabin or the closing of the police file. In fact, in the years since the discovery, the mystery of Joshua Maddux has taken on a life of its own, fueled by online sleuths and local residents who refuse to let the official accidental ruling stand. They have dug deeper into the timeline of Andrew Newman, and what they found paints an even more disturbing picture of a system that let a killer walk free. Remember that witness I mentioned earlier, the one who said Andrew bragged about putting Josh in a hole? Well, new details emerged about that conversation that make it even chilling. Apparently, this wasn't just a drunken mumble at a loud party. This was a specific, detailed confession made to a close acquaintance. The witness claimed that Andrew didn't just say he put Josh in a hole, he specifically mentioned a cabin, and he laughed about how Josh was never coming back. At the time, the witness thought Andrew was just trying to be edgy, trying to scare people because that was his thing. Andrew liked fear. He liked making people uncomfortable. But in hindsight, those words are direct confession to first-degree murder. And there is another detail about Andrew Newman that is often overlooked but is incredibly important. Andrew Newman was a fan of alternative lifestyles and living off the land. He often talked about squatting in abandoned buildings as a way to stick it to the system. This establishes a clear link between him and the Thunderhead Ranch cabin. It wasn't just a random spot in the woods to him. It was exactly the kind of place he would scout out, the kind of place he would claim as his own territory. So if Josh stumbled upon him there, or if Andrew lured Josh there, Andrew would have felt a sense of ownership over that space, and in his twisted mind, that might have justified defending it. Online investigators also poked holes in the police's timeline regarding Andrew's whereabouts. The police initially had trouble pinning Andrew to Woodland Park on the exact day Josh disappeared because Andrew lived a transient lifestyle. But records dug up by independent researchers show that Andrew was definitely in the area in May of 2008. In fact, he had encounters with local law enforcement for minor infractions in the weeks surrounding the disappearance. So the idea that we can't place him at the scene is a weak excuse. He was there. He knew the victim, he fits the profile, and he confessed to a witness. So why wasn't he charged? This is the most frustrating part of the story for the Maddux family. The legal system requires a cause of death to pursue a murder charge. Usually you need a bullet hole, a stab wound, or signs of strangulation. But because Josh's body was mummified and skeletal, the coroner couldn't definitively say he was stabbed or he was strangled. They could only say he died inside the chimney. Without a definitive cause of death, proving murder becomes a steep uphill battle. A defense attorney could easily argue, sure, Andrew is a bad guy, but you can't prove Josh didn't just climb in there and get stuck on his own. And that reasonable doubt is what kept the district attorney from signing the arrest warrant. This technicality is what keeps Mike Maddux up at night. The knowledge that the man who likely killed his son is out there, living his life, while Josh spent 7 years decomposing in a chimney just 2 blocks away. It is a specific kind of torture, a lack of closure that feels like an open wound. But let's step back from the investigation and return to the human element of this story. Because the horror of what Josh experienced inside that chimney deserves to be acknowledged and understood. We often hear true crime stories and we focus on the killer or the police work, but we forget the victim's final moments. And in the case of Joshua Maddux, those final moments are among the most terrifying ever recorded. Try to simulate it in your mind right now. Imagine you are in a space so tight that your shoulders are touching the walls. You cannot turn your head, you cannot lift your arms above your head because the space is too narrow. Gravity is pulling you down, but friction is holding you in place. Every time you exhale, your chest contracts slightly and you slide down another inch. Every time you inhale, your chest expands and scrapes against the rough brick, sucking in dust and soot. It is a slow, crushing vice. And then there's the silence. Woodland Park is quiet at night, extremely quiet. If Josh called out, his voice would travel up the chimney shaft, but the opening at the top was small, and the forest absorbs sound. He was screaming into a void, and the psychological toll of that, of knowing that your family is so close you could practically throw a rock and hit their house, is devastating. He might have heard cars driving by on the nearby road. He might have heard the faint sound of a dog barking, maybe even his own dog, but he was separated from that world by a layer of stone that might as well have been 1,000 miles thick. It forces us to confront a terrifying reality about our own safety and our own surroundings. We like to think that if we are in trouble, if we scream, someone will come. We rely on the social contract that says, if I am in danger, I will be found. But Joshua Maddux's story breaks that contract. It tells us that you can be lost in plain sight. You can be vanishingly close to safety and still be completely beyond reach. The demolition of the cabin in 2015 was a final act of erasure. The excavators returned, and this time they finished the job. The chimney was dismantled, rock by rock. The wood was carted away, and the foundation was dug up. Today, if you go to that spot in Woodland Park, there is nothing there. Just trees and grass and the wind blowing through the pines. The physical evidence of the tragedy is gone, but the energy of that place remains. Heavy. Locals still avoid that patch of woods. They say it feels colder there. They say the birds don't sing as loudly. For Kate Maddux, Josh's sister, who watched him walk out the door that morning, the discovery brought a mix of relief and fresh pain. She wrote a beautiful tribute to her brother after the body was found, saying, "Josh was one of the most gentle and sweet people I have ever known. He didn't deserve to die like this." She focuses on his life, his music, his kindness, rather than the horrific way he died, and that is a choice to remember the light rather than the darkness. But for the rest of us, the darkness is hard to ignore. The story of the boy in the chimney has become a modern cautionary tale. It's a story that parents tell their teenagers to warn them about exploring abandoned places. It's a story that makes people look twice at the old, dilapidated structures on the edge of town, wondering what or who might be hiding inside. And it serves as a grim reminder of the secrets that small towns keep. Woodland Park is a beautiful place, a tourist destination, a city above the clouds. But like every town, it has a shadow side. Beneath the scenic views and the fresh mountain air, there are stories of violence, mental illness, and tragic accidents that get swept under the rug, or, in this case, stuffed down a chimney. As of today, Andrew Newman remains a free man regarding this case. He has spent time in and out of custody for his other crimes in New Mexico, but he has never faced a jury for the death of Joshua Maddux. The case is officially closed in the eyes of the police as an accidental death. But for the community and the internet sleuths who keep the story alive, it is very much an open case, a miscarriage of justice that waits for a resolution that may never come. So, the next time you're walking in the woods and you see an old abandoned house with a crumbling chimney, maybe don't go exploring. Maybe just keep walking. Because you never know what history is buried in those ruins, and you never know if the person who put it there is watching from the shadows. That is the story of Joshua Maddux, the boy in the chimney, a story that starts with a walk on a sunny morning and ends in the most claustrophobic nightmare imaginable. It's a story that sounds impossible, a glitch in the Matrix, a horror movie script, but it is the cold, hard reality of what happened in a quiet forest in Colorado. Thank you for listening to the Cipher story. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please abuse the like button by inviting it to a fancy dinner, but then leaving it with the bill while you sneak out the bathroom window. Also, please subscribe to the Cipher story. We're building a community here of people who want to look into the shadows and understand the darker side of human nature. And if you want to support that mission, please share this video with a friend or leave a comment below with your theory on what really happened to Josh. Was it a tragic accident or was it the perfect crime? I read every single comment and I want to know what you think. Until next time, keep your eyes open, stay safe, and remember that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that happen right next door. See ya.